Welcome, everyone, to another edition of 45 Forward, where our mission is to help you, our listeners, from Los Angeles to Long Island, age successfully, making your second half of life even better than the first. Growing up on Long Island, I was an avid bird watcher, or as these hobbyists are known colloquially, a birder. Over the years, my passion and support of birds has continued to grow, like that of many older folks. But it's not just a hobby for retirees anymore. Surveys over the last few decades have shown that birdwatching has become one of the fastest growing outdoor activities in America, along with hiking, skiing, and camping. And one of the largest increases in interest has occurred among people in their 40s, the 45 Forward crowd. More recently, birding has surged during the pandemic. Not surprisingly, it's a healthy, inexpensive activity. It gets us outdoors, connecting us to nature. It's relaxing and calming, but it can also be challenging and socially engaging, while also enabling us to remain socially distanced. In today's episode, Dr. Miyoko Chu, the Senior Director of Communications at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, offers a wide-ranging conversation about the state of birds and what it means to the future of humans and to our planet overall. Trained as an ornithologist and science journalist, Miyoko works with the lab staff, supporters, and partners to engage people of all walks of life in learning about birds and protecting the natural world. She'll talk about how the lab is exploring cutting-edge technology and citizen science participation to transform people's experiences with birds and to advance science and conservation. While field guides remain traditional sources for identifying birds, innovative apps and websites are speeding up the results for all generations. Miyoko has helped create and deliver content that provides interactive online experiences through platforms such as the lab's All About Birds website, the innovative Merlin Bird ID app, bird cams, Living Bird magazine. During the current pandemic, the lab's eBird observations have led to some provocative conclusions. 80% of the bird species examined were reported in greater numbers in human-altered habitats during the pandemic lockdowns. And as we mark the Audubon Society's annual Christmas bird count, we should note that in this holiday season of gift giving, birds are one of nature's supreme and vulnerable gifts to humanity. So now let's meet today's guest, Miyoko Chu. Miyoko, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ron.
It's really a pleasure having you. I just want to start out like I do with many of my guests by just, having you talk and tell the audience a bit about you and your background, your journey, and how you got interested in birds.
Sure, yeah. Thinking back about 40 years ago, when I was 11 years old.
Wow, okay.
I was a city kid who didn't really pay attention to birds or think about them much. Didn't have any sense of urgency at the time about the environmental health of our planet. But when I was a girl, I went to San Francisco Chinatown with my father.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we went there to just go out to eat or to look around. And we passed a poultry truck that was parked there on the sidewalk selling chickens, but also pigeons and other fowl for, presumably people's dinner table. And I became very upset at that thought and started to cry. And my dad, I think, was very empathetic because when he was a boy in China, he had raised pigeons himself. And on the spot, we just decided to buy a couple of pigeons and take them home. We did not eat them. We put them, we built a coop in the backyard, and I would sit in the coop and tame them and feed them and watch them. And that was my beginning of, wow, these birds are amazing. I felt so much joy just when I was with them, when I was observing them courting and mating, eventually having babies right there in our backyard.
Wow.
And that was the start of my interest in birds.
Wow, that's great. So we're like the perfect combo. You're the city kid. I was the country kid growing up, so in those days, the suburban Long Island was still the wilds of Long Island in many respects. So, nature was our backyard. We had like 365 acres of unbroken woodlands, and so that became my little lab. And I guess as a young kid, I would go out and maybe I was I guess little boys like to collect things, so I would collect feathers and I collect rocks and shells, and I collected birds, in terms of bird lists, so, and it became, I think it gets you outdoors, certainly. And I think it brings you to another world. And I remember, going out and just feeling like, well, now I'm entering their world, and it was a very interesting experience for me, and I think it is sort of calming. I think that a lot of people now realize that as you get older, that people talk about what are recreational activities, and being outdoors is good for your health. They've discovered.
Yes, there's studies showing that nature, being in nature relieves stress and is good for well-being. And I know I've personally felt it throughout the pandemic, just going outside, going for a walk. And then often when you're on a walk, if you are tuning into birds, you'll notice something very beautiful or interesting right around you every time, because birds are easy to encounter once you start looking for them. And like you said, that collector part is a really fun aspect of being a bird watcher, collecting experiences, collecting memories, collecting species that you've seen in places that you've been while seeing them.
Right. Yeah. I think, it's been likened to you see new birds. It's sort of like a little treasure hunt. You kind of like, oh, great. I mean, yes, it's putting together a list, of your life's birds and so forth. But it's also your experiences with them and where you were and where you first saw it and so forth. So, yeah, I've enjoyed it. So let's talk about the trend. So, I'm sure that the lab is quite aware that bird watching has really increased a lot during the recent years and decades. And talk a little about what you think. Let's expand on exciting about bird watching and why people are doing it more and more.
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly during the pandemic, we saw a huge spike in interest, and we saw that through participation in our citizen science programs, where people, if they see a bird, they're able to report that, and those data are very helpful for science and conservation. But we also saw it through people just downloading our bird ID app to help them ID birds, or taking online courses, or just looking up information on our website, which really told us that bird watching was striking a chord as people were more at home. Some people might have been working from home and looking out their windows, whereas normally they wouldn't see that. I know I was around my home more, and therefore I just saw more of what was around. But also people intentionally going outside when it was safer to do that than a lot of indoor activities.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it one of the things is it offers a lot of variability of opportunity. So I guess when U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service does surveys, they look at, all right, you have occasional birders and you have active birders and you have enthusiasts, but it offers you a lot. You can do stuff, you can do it around your house, or you can go out and look for them in particular places. So I think that, yeah, I think I was reading one survey that said that birders who go birding away from home have an average age of 49, 47% being under age 45. And around the home bird watchers, an average age is 54, with 33% being under age 45. So it definitely, is breaking that old stereotype of, oh yeah, I'll just be, retire and go bird watching, or fishing, But so I think people are really enjoying it and taking part in it.
Yeah, I do think that it has the reputation of being a pastime of an older demographic, maybe because that's the time in life when we're slowing down and noticing things around us a little more, just have the time. But we're also seeing uptick in interest from younger generations as well, which is incredibly exciting. College students, high school students, school age kids. And it's a very family oriented activity too, because anybody can spot something and
Right.
say, what is that? And yeah, it's just a lot of fun, no matter whether you've ever tried it or not, or no matter what age you are.
Right. Right. And it is interesting. You can do it as a solitary thing, but it's also, a very social thing. You can certainly, there are lots of clubs, there are lots of, get togethers, there are outings. I guess, well, right now, for example, um, there's the Audubon's Christmas Bird Watch, which is ongoing now. But I know you folks also have a spring, uh, bird watching day, the global big day in May, during the migrations in May. So yeah, it does give you an opportunity to do it in lots of different ways.
That's right. And you can even do it from your own kitchen table looking out the window.
Right.
So it's the ultimate flexible hobby.
Yeah, yeah. We used to have hummingbird feeders when I was growing up, and that was always exciting to, put them out, in the kitchen window. You could just sit there and watch, and incredible to watch. But
Yeah, they are incredible just to see them because they're so beautiful with their shiny feathers and the way that they fly, and they're so tiny little jewels. They're also really incredible in terms of what they do in their lives. The ruby-throated hummingbirds that we have here in the East fly in before winter, they fly all the way across the Gulf of Mexico, some of them, and that is a more than 500-mile journey over open water for a tiny, tiny thing like
wow.
that. If you
Yeah,
imagine trying to do that as a human being, and then you compare yourself to a hummingbird, you feel,
I know.
wow, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, we'll talk a little bit more about that later, that the migration. But let's just shift a little bit and talk about the lab itself. Just give us a little bit of a sense of the range of stuff that the lab does, which really covers a lot of territory and a lot of interesting stuff, and a lot of things that average citizens can participate in.
Yes, the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, where I work, based in Ithaca, New York, is actually a worldwide organization because we do so much online with whether it's science and technology, whether it's engaging people all around the world in science and bird watching, or some of these online education courses that I mentioned. And it's really our mission just to increase the understanding and appreciation and protection of birds. And we do
Hmm.
that through all these facets of activity, ranging from research to education to citizen science and outreach.
Right, right. So let's talk a little bit about. I mean, um, I would like to talk a bit about the research. Sort of the world class science you do. The Center for Avian Population Studies, biodiversity studies. What are we learning from these projects?
Well, all these projects will study different facets of birds, weather questions about why do we have so many diverse kinds of birds in the world? How do they evolve, and how do they relate to the current day compared to the past? There's also some applied research that really has to do with what are the effects of human beings on birds? How are we
Mhm.
affecting their populations through time and through space? But yeah, part of the thrill, I think, of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology is inviting everyone to be contributors to that understanding. So, for example, in that research area that you just mentioned, we have the Macaulay Library, which is the world's largest collection of bird and other animal sounds and videos and images. And the reason it's the world's largest collection is because those are contributed by people all around the world
Mm.
documenting that diversity and color and behavior. So that is a tremendous resource in its own. And then we have a shop in bioacoustics where the researchers are studying the world of sound and animals, and how do you detect their sounds, and how do you automatically know who's there and how many there are. And that can
Mm.
apply not just to birds, but we work on elephants,
Oh,
whales, and all kinds of other animals.
wow, wow, wow. And so people could just contribute on their own. How do they do that?
Yes, well, we have a program called eBird. It's at
Okay.
ebird.org. And there's a free account where you just sign up for one. And once you've done that, you can contribute in a number of ways. If you want to contribute your bird sightings, like whether it's out your window or on a walk, you have a way to online just go and say which birds I've seen today, how many, and then you submit that. And you're able to see other people's results as well,
Mm.
which is really fantastic. But you can also upload a photo, you can upload a sound, and all those incoming data come into the Macaulay Library, the multimedia parts of that,
Right,
and then help us power a lot of this research and some of the tools that we're able to provide people.
right, right. So you're basically harnessing technology in ways that we couldn't really do this. But I mean, yes, we could do it in a much more laborious way in the past, in terms of collecting this data. But now this really enables us to really, I mean, I guess this is what we talk about when we think about big data. This is what really the power of it, that we can really do that,
It's really the cross section of technology and people power, right? When you put them together, because it's the people who are supplying the ability to hear and see the planet, the activity and wildlife across the planet, but it's the technology that enables us to ingest that and to process it and to output it and say, this is what it looks like.
Right, right. And what are we finding so far about, from our population studies? I know that, there are lots of issues about, the extinction of species and, sort of what's happening to the class of birds, aves overall. So what are some of the broad line trends that we're seeing?
Yes, well, unfortunately, what we're seeing is really alarming declines in wildlife. Birds are some of our most visible and most understood of all wildlife. They're great sentinels to tell us what's happening in our landscapes. And what they're telling us is, because birds are declining so rapidly in many places, it's signaling something that's fundamentally coming apart, that is not just affecting birds. We know it's pollinators are also declining, mammals, pretty much wherever you look, we're losing biodiversity. So that is a signal we need to pay attention to and act upon.
Yeah, I find it interesting that, there's a lot of focus now, in terms of plants, in terms of, native species, planting native plants and invasive species and their impact. And sometimes I stop and I think, well, you know what the most invasive species is? Us. I mean, we just change everything where we are. And I'm not saying certainly that's the human species, but there are consequences to that, that.
Yes, and I think, like if you imagine humans as invasive species and we're taking away the habitats and turning them into lawn and asphalt, we also have the ability to think about how to restore or reverse some of the negative impacts that we've had. Lawns is a great example, where we might be an invasive species, but we can plant native species in our gardens, and that can support a whole lot of wildlife that would otherwise vanish.
Right, right. Yeah, so we'll talk a little bit more about that. I think there are lots of things we can do to support birds. I think so certainly one of them is thinking about what we plant, and certainly living where I live in the suburbs, that lawns are very popular, but you don't need as much lawn. You can just have some aesthetic, decorative parts of it, and then around lots of the edges you can plant foliage, you can plant shrubs, you can plant things that support, birds and butterflies and lots of, uh, uh, fauna. So we're gonna talk a bit more about that but we're gonna take a quick break, Miyoko. And so, folks, we're gonna be on a short break, but there's much more to come with Miyoko Chu from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology in Ithaca, New York. So don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back, folks. We're talking today with the Senior Director of Communications at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, Miyoko Chu. Before we continue our conversation, I just wanted to mention that you can find out much more about the lab at the lab's website, which is, correct me if I'm wrong, Miyoko, www.birds.cornell.edu. Is that right?
That's it. Yep.
That's it. Okay. So after the show, you can log on and learn much more about that. But before the break, we were talking about ways to support birds that we can do, as citizen scientists or just citizen supporters. And one of the things is just being, conscious of the shrubbery and the flora around your house, and the ways in which, it's small ways, we can sort of take little bites in our suburban or urban lawns that aren't particularly supportive of birds. But what can we do, Miyoko?
Well, right before the break, we were talking about lawns and how, lawns don't support very much diversity of wildlife, including birds. But I have found some really heartening results in our own yard where I took away part of the lawn, just like a border, and put in native plants and a few shrubs. And after just a couple of years, the differences are quite amazing. I have goldfinches coming in and feeding on these beautiful, cone flowers that were purple and, filled with bees in the summertime. And in the fall, when they go to seed, I have these beautiful yellow goldfinches coming in and feeding on them. We now have more than 70 different native bee species in this
Wow.
little patch in my yard, whereas I didn't even know that many kinds of bees even existed before we started doing that. So I highly encourage that if you have that kind of space, play around with it by putting in different kinds of native plants. And even if you just have a balcony or an area where you can put pots out, that's fabulous too. You can even volunteer in your neighborhood or local parks if you have that level of interest in landscaping.
Right, right. Yeah, I think, again, you don't need to do too much. You can just, nibble away at the edges. And I find that, there are lots of edges of lawns too, where it gets close to trees. And the reality is lawns don't do well in that area anyway. It's partly shade. It gets interrupted by, tree roots, which is a natural phenomenon. So, hey, why not do something different in those areas and, create a little bit of biodiversity without even people noticing it. I mean, certainly we talked about, how it's difficult for certain birds, especially the ones who years ago relied on expanses of fields. That was their natural habitat. So those have been eliminated, and I understand there's a need for housing, but, so we look at open spaces and say, oh, let's put up a housing development, so we lose those habitats, but there are ways we can try to, push back a little bit and create some spaces, although it's difficult. A lot of birds require large expanses of space, um, and again, the opposite problem is also true. I found in suburban areas where I am, where some of the deep woods birds, they need big expanses of forests, right? And that's not happening in the suburbs, but you do what you can do. So I think some of the steps you mentioned are valuable. Anything else come to mind that we can do? What about feeding birds? What about
Yeah, well, first I want to mention you're absolutely right. There are some species that really rely on, for example, mature forests or really larger expanses of natural landscapes. But there are many birds that do fine in your little patch of yard, where they can raise a whole family of young just in the space of less than an acre. So yeah, definitely don't underestimate your contribution and your neighbor's contribution to creating a patchwork like that. But yes, in terms of making your own space bird friendly, bird feeding is one of the most popular pastimes. And if you don't have a bird feeder yet, it's a very simple thing to get started in. And you can just put in some seeds. Some of the favorite kinds of seed is called black oil sunflower seed. And that will bring in different kinds of birds that are right in your yard that you might not have seen up close before. But that's a great way to get to know them. If you want to do even a little bit more, you can make your yard extra friendly by putting up a birdhouse where some species actually want to nest inside a cavity. You can create more brushy areas that will attract birds to build inside shrubs or in trees as well. So you can leave even, a lot of people don't know this, you can leave even trees that have died standing, as long as they're not going to, be dangerous. But in our neighborhood, there's a dead tree with a hole in it where there's a family of screech owls
wow,
nesting in it. And yeah, during the pandemic, all the neighbors started realizing that there was this family there, right, in the middle of our little neighborhood, and they're quite the attraction now. And that wouldn't have happened if that dead tree wasn't left standing.
right, right. Yeah, that's nature for you. There's a purpose for everything, right? And it's sort of like, okay, let's get past the aesthetics and realize, yeah, the screech owls, a lot of woodpeckers. Yeah, I felt bad that one of our, trees in back, was not doing well and did fell over in a storm, but I was like, Oh, well, there goes that, red-bellied woodpecker family,
Oh,
have to find
yes.
some other place. But
Mhm.
yeah, yeah. Now, I guess there's some, with respect to feeding, I guess for me, there are just two things that I watch out for, which is, I think it is important. Like when I put up my feeders this fall, it's just like clean them out, clean them first, make sure that, birds do get diseases. And I guess there's been some discussion about, feeders and, sometimes being a problem for birds, in terms of passing of diseases. And I guess the second thing was like, I don't, when the spring comes, I take them down. It's like, birds were meant to eat insects. So you don't need to feed them in the summer. Yeah.
Yeah, it's quite fascinating how, in the springtime, many birds that even prefer seeds at some times of the year really need that protein source to raise their young. And so
Right.
they become very intent on finding insects at that time of year. Yeah. And you can feed them year round. We do at the Lab of Ornithology, and they'll still come in and, they'll still look for other types of food too. But, I think a lot of people take a break during spring and summer. And then when it's wintry and we're feeling much worse about their ability to find food, we start it up again.
Right. 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 Now let's talk a bit more about eBird and things like the Project Feeder Watch. Again, things that people can really participate in public.
Yes. Well, the really fun thing is that if you're interested in watching birds and contributing your effort toward science and toward conservation, there's a range of projects that you can pick depending on your lifestyle, depending on your interests. eBird is one of them. We mentioned the Christmas bird count earlier. The Christmas bird count is going on now all the way till January 5th.
Right.
And if you're interested in that, check out the National Audubon Society's website where you can learn about that count. With eBird, that's an opportunity you can do any day of the year from anywhere, anytime. So not just at Christmas, but what you do is you can just sign up and there'll be instructions on the website for how to check off which birds you've seen and when. And the amazing thing is that once you submit that information, it goes into a massive database that not only outputs visual information about what birds others have seen around you. You could check out any other part of the world if you are curious what else is being seen. And so you're contributing basically to a real-time picture of where the birds are and how many there are. And that is used by birders, but it's also used by educators, by scientists, and in conservation. Really a powerful tool to help us make decisions about how to help birds and understand what's happening to them.
Right. Right. Yeah, and I know that you authored a book called "Songbird Journeys: 4 Seasons in the Lives of Migratory Birds," and this, of course, is for me was always been an amazing just the whole idea of migration. you know, I mean, yes, there are these fantastic journeys that the birds make. Some of them, from the Arctic to the Antarctic. And there are these flyways, through the Eastern Flyway. I guess there's a central in the Americas, a central, right, and a Western. Is that right? It's basically 3 major flyways, and I think here again, it's a fascinating journey for a lot of these birds, and also a dangerous one.
Yes, I mean, the whole phenomenon of migration just really lights up the imagination. Um, a lot of us are familiar with maybe the larger birds like geese or cranes making
Hmm.
these incredible migrations, but even the smallest birds, like we talked about before, even hummingbirds, but also many tiny songbirds and warblers and thrushes and tanagers make these annual migrations as well. And not just in our hemisphere, birds are migrating across the world. So for me, what's really amazing is how do they know how to do it? Some of them even come back to the exact same spot where they had their nest the previous year. How do they survive it? How do they do this thing that we humans would not be able to do? I mean, I just have to say, one of my favorite facts, you think about a bird that hatches out in the summer, a few months later, it's making that journey
Mm-hmm.
of, potentially thousands of miles, never having traveled before. Its parents don't teach it. And the songbirds don't teach each other how to do that migration. And yet it's been doing that for, the species has been doing that for ages.
Yeah, I guess there are lots of theories. It seems to me that there may be a combination of factors. I mean, I think that people have talked about, you know, some sort of under innate understanding of stars, or navigational systems that are related to the Earth itself. But it seems is that it's not totally dissimilar. When I go going on short trips, um, you know the first segment of the journey is like, okay, I go by certain navigational guides, and then as I get closer to my destination, I'm like, okay, I recognize that. Oh, now I recognize that, and then oh, now I know exactly where I am. But it's yeah, it evolves as the journey goes.
Yes, there's some things like landmarks that they may be able to learn and use in future trips. For that first trip, it's been shown that um, during fall, for example, birds have an innate sense to go south if they're here, like where I am in Ithaca, New York. They just have this directional sense, but then they're using additional cues, like you said, like the stars, potentially like mountains or rivers, or visual cues that they may see below.
Yeah, yeah, and it's just unfortunate. It's difficult to figure out how to deal with some of the natural hazards. I mean, I guess I understand that one of the big casualties of birds is the lights of skyscrapers, right? In big cities where they, fly into windows, because a lot of we don't think about it, but a lot of birds are night flyers, right?
That's right. A lot of these songbirds travel under cover of darkness. We don't see them, but if you go out on a quiet night at the right time of year, sometimes you can hear their tiny, high-pitched notes that they're calling as they pass overhead.
Hmm.
And it's been known for ages that light attracts these birds at night. So there had been lighthouses, for example, where there, could be hundreds of birds coming in and colliding with those lighthouses. Well, today we have the equivalent in our cities, where the light from these cities can disorient birds and actually draw them in where they're at higher risk of colliding with those buildings. And you may have seen in the news, sometimes people do find large numbers of birds that have been come in because of certain weather conditions and been attracted to the light.
Yeah. And are there similar hazards with, I mean, there's been some discussion about windmills as well, these large turbines that, are in, open spaces, where you can catch the wind, but also, do present certain, especially if they're along wind streams where the birds could take advantage of the currents, they also run into these turbines. Is that right?
Yes, turbines sometimes can kill birds, especially there's concern about raptors that
Mm-hmm.
collide with them. But what's really interesting is when you look at the proportion killed by turbines versus windows, windows are by far much bigger source of mortality, just because, as you can imagine, how many buildings and windows there are. So about 624 million birds per year are estimated to collide with buildings in the
Wow.
US and Canada alone. It's a tremendous number of birds. But one of the, I guess, silver linings is that windows is one of the things we can directly change,
Mm-hmm.
unlike widespread habitat loss, which maybe you can't personally change in your own life, but taking a simple step of treating your windows so it's I can talk a little bit about techniques later if you're
Mm-hmm.
interested, but
Okay.
essentially breaking up the reflections so that the birds don't try to fly through those windows.
Right.
Um, and turning your lights off at night when they're not needed so that they're not drawn in as they're migrating overhead during that
Right.
migration season.
Right. Right. Yeah, some of the things are just our structural problems, like like where I am. We have major airports, and it's like, yeah, that's nice. That, they're geographically appropriate for airplanes, but they also happen to be, especially Kennedy Airport in Queens, where I am. It's just like, first of all, it's in the middle of a major stopover point for birds. Ecologically, it's just a stopover area. For not only water birds but all sorts of birds. And it's in the middle of the Atlantic Flyway. That's where the birds go.
And one of the things that you had mentioned with whether it's turbines or airplanes, we have technology now. There's a program called Birdcast that
Huh.
uses radar to detect where the birds are aloft and when. And this is a kind of technology that can help inform airports or wind energy companies. Hey, lots of birds aloft. Let's power down the turbines, or let's take steps at the airports to avoid collisions.
Right. That's interesting. That's sort of the reverse of fishermen, right? Who use sonar to check where the fish are. Let's go there. It's like, okay, let's go where the birds are not. So that's very interesting. I wasn't aware of that. So that's good. That's good. So Miyoko, we're going to come up and take another quick break in a few seconds. Folks, there's much more to come in our last segment with Miyoko Chu. So don't go anywhere. We will be right back after the break. Welcome back, folks. We're talking today with Miyoko Chu from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology in Ithaca, New York. Before the break, we were talking about some of the things that you can do to support birds, especially during the migration, great migration in the fall, of course, in the spring, in terms of helping them deal with some hazards like windows. So we talked a little bit about that, Miyoko, but give us a little bit more about what we can do to basically try to help reduce some of the hazards for migrating birds.
Right. Well, one of the reasons birds collide with windows is because they see a reflection in the window and they
Hmm.
think that, maybe the tree that they see there is an actual tree. So what you want to do is break up the reflection. You can do that by hanging cords, vertical cords or horizontal cords on the outside. You can do it with decals, but you have to have them close together, about 2 to 4 inches apart. Otherwise, birds are just going to try to fly in between the
Mm.
decals. So it's a relatively simple step. Anyone who's seen a bird hit a window knows how heart-wrenching it is when that happens, but they can be prevented by some of these simple steps. Even an activity that could be fun with kids, just putting tempera paint on windows, which is not permanent, and allowing them to have a bit of fun while doing that.
Right, right. Yeah. Yeah. So migration is really kind of the uh, great mysteries of birds. And there are other things too that kind of have always fascinated me. Like, um, I think I actually read a piece from the lab about this, about starlings, just when you see great flocks of starlings, travel, in amazing formations and be able to, as an entire group, be able to change directions and seemingly on a dime. I guess the term I saw was murmurations, right? That's what the
That's right.
yeah, yeah. It just never ceases to amaze me. Yeah, and I suppose there's something in the particular brain chemistry or wiring that they're able to do that.
Yeah, I think there have even been studies of the aerodynamics and the flocks and what cue does the bird behind take from the one in front. And yeah, it's a pretty fascinating and beautiful thing when you can see wonderful big flocks of birds
Right, right.
aloft.
Yeah. So in the last segment, I wanted to talk a little bit more, I guess philosophically about the relationship of birds to humans and why it matters to us and what it tells us about the state of the world. And I guess, I forget the exact figure, but like I think perhaps maybe you told me that, 1 in 4 bird species has been lost in the last time. I'm not sure exactly what time period, but we're losing a lot of birds. And what does it really mean? What does it say about the state of the planet, and also talk about this in terms of the lab's efforts in conservation and
Right.
biodiversity.
Well, it was 2 years ago when scientists at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology and collaborators at other institutions put a number to this loss of birds really for the first time. where they looked since 1970, which is the year I was born. Could they estimate how many birds we've actually lost? The number they came out to was 3 billion. As you mentioned, that's 1 in 4. So at the time when I was a child, there would have been more birds, we've lost the 1 in 4. And unfortunately, the trajectory, if you look forward, if we do nothing, we're going to lose half the populations of many bird species in the next 50 years. So really time is critical here. And we know that is true, not just for birds, but just the health of our planet. And so really, I think this is a call to action that we felt deeply within our organization and across partner organizations, but millions of people around the world who love birds, who are united, in that understanding of the joy that they bring and the cultures that they connect. People want to help birds, and by doing so, we end up helping communities of people and the overall health of our planet as well.
Yeah, I think that certainly there is just there are ecological reasons. I think that certainly one of them, and a major one, is that they're major controllers of insects, pests. That when you lose birds, you lose sort of a natural participant in controlling of species, and dealing with that's insects do many valuable things too, but if you lose, just like or similar to in my area, when you remove predators, like big cats, the deer population goes in excess, so you're throwing off the balance of nature, and not just it's a loss of biodiversity.
Right. It's all interconnected. And as you mentioned, the birds, some of the fastest declining birds that we see are called aerial insectivores. They're the birds that eat flying insects. So you think about, they can consume quite a bit of mosquitoes, for example, or other pests, but also, whether it's on crops or in wild landscapes, they have a role to play. You can also even think about scavengers, right? Like vultures, they're the cleanup crew
Right.
of the world. So those we call ecosystem services, because birds do provide some services to nature. At the same time, they're also just like priceless in terms of their beauty and their uniqueness, the inspiration, and their place in our world. And when we lose one, we can never get one back.
Right. Yeah, when years ago, my mother, who was a painter, she painted porcelain china, and I still have, not too far from me right now, 2 of her lamps in which she painted birds of paradise.
Oh, wow.
And they've always been like an amazing, like, wow, these creatures actually exist. And that's one of my I suppose bucket list things. I'd like to go and see some birds of paradise, South or Central America.
Yes, and for those of you who've never seen them, if you Google on YouTube birds of paradise in Cornell, you'll come up with one of our viral videos that showcases a whole bunch of these different kinds of birds in paradise that will blow your mind. We call them shape shifters, some of them, because they turn into shapes that don't even look like birds. They're very otherworldly sometimes. Other ones are just extravagantly beautiful because they evolved in a place without predators. So they had the ability to, have incredibly exorbitant feathers without it, costing them their lives at the hands of a predator.
Right.
So they are worth looking for. Looking at pictures or videos of them.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I also discovered about, for me personally, from watching birds over the years, was just realizing that there were different styles of doing it. So so there was one for me of, okay, I can go out and look for birds actively look for birds. So I'd, pick out an area or woods or something, and I'd go from spot to spot to spot. But then at a certain point, I also realized that there was a totally different way of also looking at birds, which is to stay in one spot and wait for them. Obviously look for a spot that may be at the intersection of the woods and fields, someplace where there would be more feeding and so forth. But that was equally valid and equally productive in some ways. And to me, that became sort of a metaphor for life. In some ways, sometimes you could look for something and go, and yes, be active and proactive, but sometimes just wait, just be patient and wait and observe it. Things will come to you.
Yes, I love how you've described that, because whether it's you're looking for adventure and your treasure out there, or whether you have it come to you, it works equally well with bird watching. And there are special rewards with what we sometimes call birding your patch, right? There's a special spot to you. It could be right next to your home, but you take the time to spend, the changing seasons there, and you'll see things that surprise you all the time and that change throughout the year and from year to year. And that's really a special and rewarding way to experience birds as well.
Yeah. And now the one thing too that's changed over the course of my life is that and especially the lab has done a lot of work, and you've mentioned, but perhaps worth mentioning again, is that I guess as you get older like me, and not quite as mobile, you would go out and you hear birds. I'm like, okay, now I think I know what that is, but I'm not positive, and I can't find it, especially if they're warblers up in the treetops, and so now you have ways to identify them.
Yes. So if there's one thing that anyone does after this show, if you haven't done it already, look for the free Merlin Bird ID app, because that app will really help you identify birds in a very fun and easy way. And we just released last year the ability to help identify birds by sound. And it's a really fun experience. You just go kind of like the Shazam, right, for birds.
Right.
But instead of identifying music, it'll identify what bird you've heard and show you a picture of that bird. But you can also take a photo. It'll identify it based on the photo, or you can describe it and it'll based on your description, tell you what you saw. And the really fun thing about this tool is the reason it works so well is because what we talked about before, the combination of technology and people power, where we have received just thousands of photos and sounds from people that are used to teach the computer, this is what this bird sounds like. So when you hear it, Merlin is able to help you identify that. So it's really a team effort that this was created by bird watchers, scientists, and computer whizzes.
Wow, that's great. Merlin, I just want to repeat
Merlin Bird ID app, yes.
Merlin Bird ID, great. Okay. So before we go, I just want to also let the audience know the lab is supported by the public. It's a nonprofit. So how do people contribute? How do they donate?
Yes, we are reliant on donations in order to do our mission. And you just go to our website, birds.cornell.edu, if you would like to contribute. And if you join as a member, you will also get our beautiful Living Bird magazine once every quarter. And it's filled with beautiful photos and inspiring stories about birds.
Right. Full disclosure, I am a member, and so I have my latest copy of Living Bird. So it is a great publication. So, well, Miyoko, there's much more to talk about, and maybe we'll come back for the big day in the spring. We'll bring you back and bring back some of your colleagues and see how the spring migration goes. But in the meantime, if people have questions about how would they contact you? What's the best way to contact you?
We have an email address at cornellbirds
Okay.
at cornell.edu.
Okay.
cornellbirds@cornell.edu. And if you have a question, you can send it over there and we'll see if we can get you connected with, your journey with birds, no matter where you are on that journey.
Great. Thanks. Right. Okay, folks. So once again, tell your friends if you've missed my conversation with Miyoko Chu today, you can still listen to it as a podcast on voiceamerica.com. Just search my show 45 Forward. You could also find it on Apple and Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or go to my website, roelresources.com, and just click on the 45 Forward tab, where you can find out more about Miyoko, and also people can listen to the episode. So, folks, be sure to join me next Monday, 12 noon Pacific, or 3 p.m. Eastern Time. I'll be doing my post-Christmas chat with Tara Bowman. It's a very interesting encore conversation that I had with Tara, who used to be the program director, now is the executive director of the National Aging in Place Council, an organization whose mission is to provide resources and professional experts to help people age in place safely, comfortably, and successfully. So, folks, until then, keep moving forward, 45 Forward.